The death threats against the federal judge had been escalating for weeks, but courthouse security guard Marcus Williams was the first to recognize the assassination planning pattern. Because identifying judicial threats, analyzing attack methodologies, and predicting courthouse violence weren't skills he'd learned from court security training. They were techniques he'd mastered during 15 years as a U.S. Marshal whose judicial protection work had safeguarded federal judges from the country's most dangerous criminals and terrorists. Marcus Williams had been working security at the Federal District Courthouse for 7 years, and in that time he'd become more than just a guard. He'd become a trusted protector of the American justice system. The courthouse served the entire federal district, handling everything from white-collar crime prosecutions to terrorism trials, where federal judges made decisions that affected national security and public safety. At 51, Marcus carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood both the dignity of the judicial process and the dangers that came with enforcing federal law against the country's most dangerous criminals. Tall, solid build, and the kind of commanding presence that made visitors feel secure while making potential troublemakers reconsider their intentions. He wore his uniform with professional pride and moved through the courthouse with the methodical awareness of someone who understood that judicial security was about protecting both people and constitutional principles. The courthouse itself was an imposing symbol of federal authority. Marble columns, high ceilings, and the formal atmosphere where constitutional rights were defended and federal crimes were prosecuted. It was a place where justice was administered, where victims found closure, and where dangerous criminals received sentences that protected society from their continued threat. What made Marcus different from typical courthouse security was his understanding of how threats against federal judges developed and escalated, especially from defendants and criminal organizations who saw judicial decisions as personal attacks deserving violent retaliation. While other guards focused on metal detectors and visitor screening, Marcus found himself automatically assessing threat indicators, monitoring concerning behaviors, and recognizing warning signs that could predict when legal disputes might escalate to targeted violence against judicial personnel. The problem had started 2 months ago when Judge Patricia Hamilton had sentenced Vincent "Vinny" Torino, a high-ranking member of organized crime, to life in prison without parole for racketeering and murder. The sentence had been appropriate given the evidence, but it had also made Judge Hamilton a target for retaliation from Torino's criminal associates who viewed the conviction as a declaration of war against their organization. The threats had begun as anonymous messages posted on social media and sent through untraceable email accounts, expressing anger about Judge Hamilton's sentencing decisions and making vague references to justice and consequences. But over the past month, the messages had become more specific, referencing the judge's daily routines, her family members, and detailed knowledge of courthouse security procedures. Marcus began conducting what he privately called a judicial threat assessment, using methodologies that weren't part of standard courthouse security but were essential for understanding when threats against federal judges posed genuine dangers. He analyzed the language patterns in the messages, tracked their escalation and timing, and evaluated the level of operational knowledge they contained about courthouse operations and judicial schedules. The profile that emerged was deeply concerning. The threat maker demonstrated detailed surveillance of Judge Hamilton's movements, knowledge of her parking routines and office schedule, and familiarity with courthouse security procedures that suggested either inside access or extensive reconnaissance. The messages showed escalating anger combined with specific grievances related to the Torino sentencing and other organized crime prosecutions. Most troubling, the threats included language that suggested the subject was moving from general anger toward operational planning for targeted assassination. References to Permanent solutions and final justice, combined with detailed knowledge of the judge's vulnerable moments, indicated someone who had progressed beyond angry venting towards serious consideration of violent action. Marcus's U.S. Marshal training had taught him that threats against federal judges were among the most dangerous in law enforcement because they combined criminal desperation with detailed planning and often had the resources of organized crime behind them. The threat pattern he was observing matched indicators for assassination planning that required immediate federal intervention. Over the next week, Marcus implemented protective intelligence gathering while maintaining his routine security duties. He coordinated with courthouse administration to review visitor logs and identify individuals conducting unusual surveillance of Judge Hamilton's courtroom and chambers. He analyzed security camera footage for patterns of reconnaissance activity, and he evaluated the operational methods that would allow someone to gather the detailed information appearing in the threats. The investigation revealed that the threat maker had conducted systematic surveillance of Judge Hamilton's judicial activities, studying her court schedule, parking routines, and the security procedures that protected her during daily courthouse operations. More concerning, the surveillance extended to her personal life, including her family members and residential security arrangements. The behavioral pattern indicated someone with significant resources and criminal expertise. The threat maker was using sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques to avoid detection, employed multiple communication methods to maintain anonymity, and demonstrated knowledge of federal judicial protection protocols that suggested either law enforcement experience or extensive criminal intelligence gathering. Marcus's federal training allowed him to recognize that this wasn't isolated anger from a single individual. The level of coordination and resources suggested involvement by organized crime figures who viewed Judge Hamilton's sentencing decisions as threats to their criminal enterprise that warranted violent retaliation. Most critically, Marcus identified that the threat maker was focusing on specific vulnerabilities in judicial protection, particularly moments when Judge Hamilton moved between her chambers, courtroom, and parking garage. This targeting of transition points was a classic indicator of assassination planning that required immediate protective intervention. Marcus's breakthrough came when he connected the threat pattern to intelligence about organized crime retaliation that he'd developed during his U.S. Marshal years. The detailed knowledge of courthouse operations combined with the specific targeting of Judge Hamilton suggested coordination with criminal organizations that had both motive and capability for judicial assassination. Marcus contacted his former supervisor at the U.S. Marshal Service, Chief Deputy Sarah Chen, who now managed judicial security for the Federal District. The Marshal Service had been tracking threats against federal judges involved in organized crime prosecutions, and Judge Hamilton's case fit a pattern of escalating criminal retaliation they'd been investigating. "Marcus, this threat assessment is exactly the kind of intelligence we need," Chief Chen explained during their secure phone conversation. "The organized crime connections and the operational planning indicators suggest this goes beyond individual anger to coordinated criminal conspiracy against federal judicial personnel." The U.S. Marshals wanted Marcus to continue his courthouse security work while serving as a protective intelligence asset for their judicial security operation. He would monitor threat activities, document escalation patterns, and coordinate with federal protective details to ensure Judge Hamilton's safety while maintaining the courthouse's normal operations. The approach required careful balance between judicial independence and security necessity. Federal judges valued their ability to conduct proceedings without obvious protective presence. But genuine threats required resources that only the U.S. Marshal Service could provide effectively. Over the next month, Marcus conducted sophisticated protective intelligence gathering while maintaining routine courthouse security duties. His legitimate access to every area of the courthouse allowed him to observe potential surveillance activities, document concerning behaviors, and coordinate with federal protective details without disrupting judicial proceedings. The intelligence revealed that the threats against Judge Hamilton were part of a larger organized crime retaliation campaign targeting federal judges involved in prosecutions of criminal enterprises. The coordination involved multiple criminal organizations that viewed aggressive federal sentencing as existential threats to their operations. Marcus's U.S. Marshal training allowed him to recognize operational patterns that indicated escalation toward action. The threat makers had moved from general complaints to specific targeting, from anonymous messaging to active surveillance, and from individual anger to coordinated planning involving criminal resources and expertise. Most concerning, the surveillance activities suggested that the threat makers were studying not just Judge Hamilton's routines, but also the response capabilities of courthouse security and federal protective details. This kind of counter-surveillance planning indicated preparation for defeating security measures rather than simply intimidating judicial personnel. The crisis escalated when Marcus identified active surveillance of Judge Hamilton during a high-profile organized crime sentencing hearing. The individual conducting surveillance was using professional techniques to avoid detection while gathering intelligence about judicial protection procedures and courthouse security responses. Marcus immediately activated the protective response protocol he had developed with federal agents. The surveillance subject was not confronted directly, which could have triggered immediate assassination attempts, but his activities were documented and reported to the U.S. Marshals protective detail responsible for judicial security. The surveillance revealed that the threat against Judge Hamilton had progressed to operational planning phase. The subject had detailed knowledge of her judicial schedule, had studied security procedures during high-profile hearings, and was coordinating with additional individuals who appeared to be conducting counter-surveillance of federal protective measures. Marcus coordinated with U.S. Marshals to ensure they had complete situational awareness of courthouse operations and potential threat scenarios. His understanding of both judicial procedures and criminal threat methodologies was essential for ensuring protective intervention succeeded without disrupting constitutional judicial processes. The U.S. Marshals coordinated a comprehensive response that included enhanced judicial protection, organized crime investigation, and courthouse security measures designed to interrupt assassination planning while preserving judicial independence. Marcus's intelligence had identified a coordinated threat that required federal resources and expertise. Marcus's role during the intervention was to provide real-time intelligence on courthouse operations and potential security vulnerabilities, while maintaining his cover until federal agents could neutralize the threats. His understanding of both judicial procedures and criminal methodologies was crucial for ensuring the intervention protected Judge Hamilton without compromising ongoing legal proceedings. The intervention revealed the scope of the organized crime conspiracy. Multiple criminal organizations had coordinated resources to target Judge Hamilton and other federal judges involved in prosecutions that threatened their operations. The planning included detailed reconnaissance of judicial security, acquisition of weapons and surveillance equipment, and coordination with corrupt insiders who provided intelligence about judicial schedules and security procedures. Federal arrests disrupted the assassination conspiracy before it could be implemented, resulting in additional federal charges against organized crime figures and their associates. The investigation also revealed broader threats against federal judicial personnel that required enhanced protective measures nationwide. The aftermath of the federal intervention revealed Marcus's role to his shocked colleagues and courthouse administration. The reliable courthouse security guard who had handled everything from visitor screening to emergency response was actually a former U.S. Marshal whose judicial protection expertise had prevented the assassination of a federal judge and dismantled an organized crime conspiracy. Chief Judge William Rodriguez was the first to understand the scope of what had happened. "Marcus, you've been conducting federal protective intelligence for months while handling routine courthouse security," he said during the post-incident briefing. You prevented an assassination that could have undermined the entire federal judicial system. Court Administrator Lisa Thompson struggled to process how the security guard she'd worked with for 7 years had managed such a complex protective operation. Marcus, you identified and stopped an organized crime conspiracy that threatened our most basic constitutional principles. How did you recognize what federal investigators had missed? That's exactly why it worked, Marcus explained to the assembled group of judges, administrators, and security personnel. If I had approached this as a former U.S. Marshal, it would have created security complications that could have compromised both the investigation and normal judicial operations. But as a courthouse security guard with good observational skills, I could gather protective intelligence and coordinate with federal resources without disrupting the constitutional processes we're sworn to protect. Chief Chen arrived at the courthouse to personally thank Marcus for his work and address concerns about ongoing judicial security. Deputy Marshal Williams's protective intelligence work was textbook judicial security, she announced. His understanding of organized crime methodologies and his position within the courthouse community allowed us to prevent an assassination conspiracy that threatened the foundations of federal justice. Following the intervention, the federal courthouse implemented enhanced judicial protection protocols based on Marcus's recommendations and U.S. Marshals' best practices. The changes included improved threat assessment procedures, coordinated intelligence sharing, and protective measures that safeguarded judicial independence while ensuring security. Marcus worked with courthouse administration and federal protective services to develop threat recognition protocols that could identify organized crime retaliation without compromising judicial proceedings. The training emphasized understanding criminal methodologies, recognizing escalation patterns, and coordinating with federal protective resources. The U.S. Marshals offered Marcus positions with federal judicial protection details nationwide, but he had discovered something important during his 7 years at the courthouse. He genuinely valued protecting the constitutional processes that made American justice possible. Marcus decided to stay with the courthouse, but with an expanded role that recognized his expertise. The federal judiciary hired him as Director of Judicial Security, responsible for developing protective protocols for federal courthouses throughout the district. The U.S. Marshals maintained Marcus as a consultant, available for cases where his specific expertise in judicial protection could make a difference. But his primary focus remained on protecting the constitutional processes that allowed federal justice to function without fear of criminal retaliation. Federal law enforcement agencies worked with Marcus to develop judicial protection programs that could prevent organized crime intimidation while preserving the judicial independence essential for constitutional government. His protocols became models for courthouse security nationwide. 2 years later, Marcus had transformed judicial security operations at federal courthouses across the region. His protocols for threat assessment, organized crime intelligence, and federal coordination had prevented numerous threats against judicial personnel while maintaining the constitutional processes that made federal justice possible. More importantly, Marcus had demonstrated that effective judicial security required understanding criminal behavior well enough to prevent attacks, not just responding after judges and court personnel had been threatened or harmed. His approach combined federal protective expertise with genuine understanding of constitutional principles and the judicial independence essential for democratic government. The courthouse itself had become a model for federal judicial security. Law enforcement agencies pointed to it as an example of successful constitutional protection that defended both judicial personnel and democratic principles. Federal Protective Services used it for training exercises on courthouse-based threat assessment. Detective Maria Santos, who had worked with Marcus throughout the federal intervention, often brought new officers to the courthouse for training. "This is what professional judicial security looks like," she would tell them. "Not just screening visitors and checking IDs, but understanding criminal organizations well enough to prevent attacks on the constitutional processes that make justice possible. Marcus Williams continues his security work at the Federal District Courthouse, but everyone in the judicial community now understands that their Director of Judicial Security brings something unique to his role. He's the former U.S. Marshal who chose constitutional protection over federal career advancement, who understands that protecting judges and court personnel is essential for maintaining the rule of law that makes American democracy possible. His story reminds us that expertise developed in federal service doesn't end when someone leaves government employment. It continues in new forms of constitutional protection that may be less visible but are equally essential to the people whose freedoms depend on an independent judiciary capable of administering justice without fear of criminal retaliation. Sometimes the person ensuring security at an American courthouse carries training from the U.S. Marshal Service's most elite judicial protection units, quietly preventing assassination attempts with skills developed safeguarding federal judges from the nation's most dangerous criminals. These are the professionals who understand that constitutional government requires not just laws and procedures, but the security that allows justice to be administered without intimidation or violence. Marcus's choice to remain in judicial security work rather than return to federal law enforcement represents something fundamental about constitutional protection: that defending democratic institutions doesn't require federal authority or high-profile assignments. Sometimes the most essential service happens quietly in courthouses across America, provided by professionals whose expertise ensures that justice can be administered fairly and independently.